DESIblitz.com.
Hi, I'm Madhavi Menon, speaking to you from JLF at the British Library in London in June. Meant to be a wonderful summer June day, but it's been raining all morning. But we've been having a wonderful time at JLF, and you're watching me on DESIblitz.com. I'm not sure I have a love for love so much, because love seems to me, so I'm a scholar of desire, that's what I work on. And I don't love love so much because love is a very sort of sentimentalized framework. And with sentimentality comes sort of rules and normativity. So the idea that everyone must fall in love or should fall in love. And then once you're in love, you need to stay in love and not fall out of love. I think all these concepts actually put a lot of pressure on us. So I'm much more interested in desire, which actually doesn't work within categories, or doesn't work within norms or rules or shoulds and do's and don'ts. Desire, even as early as the 2nd century, Vatsyayana says in the Kama Sutra, which of course is famous around the world, he says, passion knows no borders. And that's what I'm interested in, this idea of something that is non-normative, non-prescriptive, that doesn't tell you how you should be. And voila, it turns out that how you should be is how the whole world should be. And I'm not interested in how the whole world should be. I'm interested in things that might undermine structures that constrain us. No, I don't. But I do think acceptable expressions of desire vary across culture and across narratives. And so it's not that I think people everywhere are the same, but I do think that people everywhere are doomed not to coincide with their desire, by which I mean everyone in the world, I think, has the experience of sort of saying, oh, do I look the way I want to look? Or do I like the person I think I like? Or does the person I like me the way in which I want them to like me? And throughout the world, at whatever parts in our lives, however often or infrequently in our lives, if we're lucky, we come face to face with that failure of our desire to coincide with itself. That our idea of desire simply does not come to pass or come to fruition. Which is why, of course, we keep looking and we keep buying new things or trying on new looks or new outfits and, you know. And so for me, that aspect of desire is universal. That it doesn't really matter where you're from or what you do. We all face a certain kind of desire to be exactly what we think of ourselves as being. The image in our head, and the failure to coincide with that image. But I do think that cultural specific forms of how we express that desire exist. So in different parts of the world, and this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, love is supposed to sort of precede marriage, and then, you know, marriage is supposed to last happily ever after, when we know that that's far from being true, but we still sort of try and believe that narrative. So desire is categorized and policed in different ways in different parts of the world, but I think the idea of desire itself is fairly universal. I mean, I grew up in Delhi, and you know, we didn't have, I mean, I always knew I was a feminist, although we didn't always have the vocabulary for it. I remember I once sort of started a colony, you know, we still call neighborhoods in Delhi colonies. We started a colony newsletter, and I was the editor, and my first editorial, the headline was, I was maybe 10 years old, the headline was, boys are a problem, : what should we do? ? And so that was one of my earliest sort of memories of writing. And it's not that, you know, people who say, oh, we're not feminists because we don't hate men. And I think that's such a reductive way of thinking about feminism, because feminism is really about not subscribing to a worldview that thinks women are inferior to men. And men can subscribe to this worldview, women can subscribe to this worldview, and I don't think it has anything to do with hating men. So it's not necessarily that I hate men, but I do hate certain structures that accord privilege to men. And it's hard for men too. It's not easy to feel that you always have to be strong, you always have to earn money, you always, you can't cry. Boys Don't Cry, the title of that famous film. And so I think it's a lose-lose situation. Not being a feminist is a lose-lose situation for men and women alike. And so for me, from a very early age, I was extremely committed to this idea. And I think another thing that helped me, my mother was a professor, my family is from Kerala, in the very southernmost tip of India, and we're from a particular caste called the Nayars, the Hindu Nayars, which is a matrilineal caste. So the family name and property passes down through the women. And so my ancestors, and I actually have written about this in my book, my female ancestors never got married. Nayar women never got married because they already had their family name and they already had their property. So they didn't need to get married to anybody. So they would just sleep with whoever they wanted. And the joke in Kerala was that you would know a woman was sexually busy if the guy left his umbrella and his slippers outside her door. And then you would know not to knock and find out whether she was available or not. So I think I come from a long tradition of strong women who don't necessarily feel the pull of patriarchy in quite the same way. And so I was very lucky to have that in my upbringing. Well, I think the Supreme Court judgment finally was just wonderful, brilliant, a breath of fresh air. We were all so relieved. But the one irony about that judgment, and I actually have written an article about this, is that, so there were 4 different verdicts written up by different judges, each of them wonderful, brilliant judges, very, very well thought through verdicts. But not a single one of them referred to any historical example from the Indian subcontinent. So all their examples were Oscar Wilde or Shakespeare or, whoever it is, James Baldwin. And I think my critique of that would be that we are so cut off from the entire Indic cultural landscape in which desire was so much more free than it has been at any point in the West at any time in history. And so we have textbooks, wall sculptures, temple carvings, paintings, poetry that would make, as I keep saying, that would make Madonna seem like a nun. Right? It was that explicit. The temple carvings in Khajuraho from 1,000 years ago portray orgies, threesomes, cunnilingus, women having sex, and the joke, of course, is that most of those sexual positions are illegal in India today. So the idea is we need to think who we were, not who we want to be, that the West describes as being who we need to be. But this is not the same thing as saying, oh, we were so wonderful always. I think we were awful in many, many ways. But I think in the realm of desire, there was just so much flow of ideas. And we're looking to Oscar Wilde to sort of justify homosexuality in India today. And, don't get me wrong, I adore Oscar Wilde. I'm a professor of English. But all I'm saying is that we need to change the lens through which we look at sexuality and not have it be only a Western lens. Because in fact, these other lenses have been much more capacious and much more indulgent and much more allowing than a lot of these other lenses. Well, I think the irony is that what gets described as Indian values today, increasingly in political debates and things like that, are really British values from the 18th and 19th centuries, right? And the irony is, so those British values, and remember, Victorian morality comes to India at a time where in England, piano legs had to be covered because it was thought, unseemly for us to see the legs of pianos. So Victorian morality coupled with, and this is why I said it's not that everything about India's past is so wonderful, because there's lots that's not. But Victorian morality coupled with what was worst in India's traditions, by which, for instance, I mean a certain notion of caste purity, in which the idea of having sex with or desire for someone not of your caste was in many texts frowned upon or looked down upon. And so what the British colonials were able to do really, what the British colonists were able to do really well, was to pick up these strands of divisiveness that already existed among certain ways of thinking in India and capitalize on those in order to further their own agenda. So what we call Indian values today is British Victorian morality coupled with the worst systems of caste and class prejudice that we've had for thousands of years. You know, it really depends. So I am not, I think with the rise in social media, with the rise, you know, the sort of, there's a study that measures how much pornography people view in different countries in the world. And India has now beaten Canada as to number 3. And a large percentage of porn watchers in India are women. And I love that because it is clear that women have desire, and desire that they want to, that they don't mind pushing to certain kinds of limits. But, and this is the problem with the mode in which they consume that desire, it tends to remain very private. And it tends to remain in a space in which they can't necessarily act on it. And so it's a difficult question, you see. So they might be more daring in figuring out and identifying their desires, but perhaps as constrained in being able to express them. So I don't know how to judge whether that means they're more liberated or less liberated. I think that's a sort of tricky question. But I really do think women we need to think about what our desires are and what we desire, which is why I think this entire Me Too movement, and especially the way in which it has expressed itself in India, I still think we're giving men too much attention. And I keep saying, I'd rather not think about the men. I want to think about us. I want to think about what it is that we want. Because I think once we know what we want, not colored by the shame that we are taught to think about in relation to our desires, not covered by the guilt that we are made to feel for having desire, I think we'll actually be a lot more capable of saying no when we want to say no, because we're thinking about ourselves. So it's a complex question. Well, I think we've regressed, right? I mean, I think 1,000 years ago we were much more liberated and expressive than we are now. We've really regressed. And you see, the trouble is, and this goes back to the political argument I was making earlier, we are now beginning to speak a language of sexual freedom, of identities, of multiple categories, of trans, bi, polyamorous, all that stuff. And we think we're liberated in speaking those categories. But actually, all we're doing is sort of saying, okay, my desire fits into this category. Can you just create another category for someone else's desire? And I prefer a landscape. And again, to sort of go back to either Sufi poetry or the Kama Sutra, I prefer a landscape in which we don't necessarily have to name our desires, in which we don't necessarily have to say, this is who I am, because I want to have the freedom to maybe change who I am tomorrow or this evening. But the trouble with a certain kind of neoliberal identity politics that unfortunately a lot of people are subscribing to these days is that we feel if we have a name, we have freedom. And names, in as much as they confer identities on us, are not always liberating. They're often traps. And we can get trapped in an identity that I think we need to actually find some way of getting out of. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about desire is not necessarily that thing that gets encapsulated within a framework. I mean, it's an issue around the world. I just watched the show on Netflix, I don't know whether you did, Delhi Crime, which was so well done and so horrific. And it is absolutely horrific. I mean, rape is one of those things that is just brings nakedly, as it were, to the fore the way in which sex is related to power. That there is nothing about rape that does anything except exert power. And, you have to wonder, for instance, so many people just sort of say, oh, I saw that woman and I decided to rape her. And it's like, well, how do you get an erection within 30 seconds of seeing someone? But the erection has actually nothing to do with her or her body. The erection has everything to do with the power that you can exert over her and her body, which is why I think it's a complete mistake to think about how women dress or what women wear, because it actually has nothing to do with what you wear. Women in burqas get raped. Women in miniskirts get raped. Women covered from head to toe get raped. Women wearing miniskirts get raped. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with how can I perhaps address my own feeling of deficiency by exerting power over a body that has been deemed weaker than mine. And so the horrific aspect of rape is that it really brings us face to face with the idea that sex is connected to power. The interesting part of it, not of rape, the interesting part of this connection is that I think we need to think more often about sex in relation to dynamics of power, which we don't. Because often, and when we do think about it in relation to dynamics of power, we tend to be very simplistic about it, saying there shouldn't be a power differential between people having sex. And we forget about the fact that sometimes power differences are very sexy. And so we just need to be complicated about how we think about desire. We need to make much more complex how we think about sex. And so for me, the only useful part of thinking about rape is that it really pushes to the limit something that might mark all our relation to sex to a different degree on an ordinary, everyday basis.